Good morning, psychologists. How are you? Hope you're okay. We're on to our last bit of psychopathology now before we move on to the Year 13 section of research methods. Then we've got issues and debates, biopsychology, gender schizophrenia and forensics. And then we are finished for the 2 years, hopefully. So I'm not going to do a video on the introduction to OCD because I feel like it's quite self-explanatory to categorise those different aspects of OCD. So I thought I'd jump straight into the biological explanation. So OCD is a biological explanation. Phobias was a behavioural perspective and depression was cognitive. So this is why we did approaches right at the very start, so that you have a good underpinning knowledge of each of those approaches so that now you can apply them to various areas within the course. So the biological aspect then is the trickiest. Students find it the hardest to get their head around, and this is why the examiners love it and it comes up quite often. So I think it came up 2 years ago and people performed quite poorly on this question because they weren't really sure what the biological explanation was. So I tried to make it as simplistic as possible. Obviously you can use your book to make extra notes. I've taken the evaluation from the book, but I'll just try and explain it a little bit better for you. So we'll see how we get on. Quick recap quiz though, bit of interleaving of knowledge. So you've got 5 questions there from what we've looked at so far in the course. So pause this, have a go at answering them. You haven't got to make any notes, but you can just test yourself like a mini quiz. And then any ones that you weren't sure of, maybe it's double single blind, maybe it's what interference is, can't remember 44 Thieves, direct some of your independent time to revising those areas. Because like I've said, nothing's been said about exams for you guys at the moment. So we're going ahead as normal. We're planning for us to get through these 11 topics and also know them all really, really well. So make sure that you keep practicing that. Then the answers are here for you to have a look at. So explaining OCD then. OCD is explained biologically. Now, like phobias and depression, there are different aspects as to which you can explain it, but the prominence here is the biological approach. So we've got some key terms here for you to have a go at defining. What can you remember from the biological approach right at the start of year 12? Key terms are really important in your essays to be defined. So don't just chuck comorbidity in there or diathesis stress or polygenic. You want to make sure that you are explaining to the examiner what they mean. So you've heard it in GCSE and I'm going to say the exact same thing. Treat the examiner like they have no idea as to what they're doing. So you want to make sure that you are really concise, but also exploratory in some of your definitions. So have a go at this. What can you remember? You can always purple pen when we go through it in a minute. The ones that you weren't sure of. All of these are really important to this section. So you need to pretty much know all of these to be able to effectively write a good 16 marker on explanations. So pause this, have a go at that. And then very briefly, they're quite small, but I've got each of the definitions. So a genetic explanation focuses on chromosomes and DNA that determine your behaviour. Comorbidity is where we have 2 or more disorders present together. So if you have OCD, more than likely you're going to have depression. If you have schizophrenia, you're definitely going to have OCD. So they kind of overlap with each other. A neural explanation is looking at how the nervous system determines psychological characteristics. So it's things like different brain areas are responsible for certain behaviours. So maybe the ventral, so in schizophrenia, for example, the ventral striatum is really important for positive symptoms. Polygenic is where we have more than one gene that contributes to a disorder. So in OCD, we've got over 230 that are attributed to OCD. Serotonin, a neurotransmitter that's implicated or has some kind of feature in OCD. Diathesis stress is basically a combination of biological and environmental. So you can have a biological predisposition. So let's say you have a certain one of the genes associated with OCD, and also have a biological an environmental trigger. So a stressful environment, psychological or physical abuse that can trigger OCD to manifest itself. A neuron, a nerve cell that processes, transmits certain messages, and a neurotransmitter, so it's released from the synaptic vesicles, presynaptic to postsynaptic across the synapse, and relays signals. Okay, so they are key words that we need for this section. So if I try and break it down then to you. So for a biological explanation, we have two. And if your essay said something like, discuss one or more biological explanations of OCD, you'd need to talk about both of these, genetic and neural. It might say in an 8 marker, describe and evaluate one explanation, then you can choose genetic or neural, but I would try and get both in there just to really broaden your essay. So a genetic explanation then is the predisposition to OCD might be inherited from parents, grandparents, siblings, whatever. Genetics aren't as well established as some other explanation, but things like the anxiety gene, they're really trying to test for. Same with depression. But fundamentally, most mental disorders have a genetic background. They have a genetic vulnerability. So information for a genetic explanation comes from 3 sources. So we look at family studies, we look at twin studies, and a variety of different new research methods. Okay, so that's your genetic element. We've also got a neural perspective here. So this is the genes associated with OCD are going to affect neurotransmitter levels as well as brain structures. So it's defined as an abnormal functioning of neurotransmitters like serotonin and abnormal functioning of brain structures. So for example, for OCD, the basal ganglia doesn't perform as well as it should compared to control groups, and the prefrontal cortex, which you'll have a look at as well. So the neural explanation is about how the genes have affected neurotransmitter levels and brain structures. So if we focus on the genetic explanation firstly, the diathesis stress falls into this genetic explanation. Think of it like an umbrella. So you've got biological split into genetic and neural, then genetic is split further into diathesis stress, which is where you have a biological predisposition, so maybe a gene that manifests in a stressful environment. So, for example, we all have cancer within us, okay? And it takes some kind of trigger to make that manifest, make that come to the forefront. And it's the same with mental disorders. So quite an old bit of research from 1936 from Lewis. OCD patients, 37% of OCD patients had parents with OCD, 21% had siblings with OCD vulnerability. So the genes make you more likely to suffer the diathesis, but it needs an environmental trigger. So the diathesis is the gene, and the stress is the environment. Okay, so if you're in a stressful environment, it's more likely to manifest. So we've got genetic explanation, diathesis, and candidate genes is also a genetic explanation. And this is where we have, so if you think of a candidate, like going to an interview, they are, you know, the main person in the running. Same with genes. SHT1D beta has been identified to have a link to serotonin, which we know is implicated in OCD, as having some kind of relevance. That's the only candidate gene that they've pinpointed to have some kind of relevance. However, polygenic, another aspect of the genetic explanation, is having multiple genes. So like I said earlier, there's up to 230 genes that could be implicated in the OCD manifestation. Okay, so how can we be certain any one gene or anything specific has any kind of relevance than others? So the genes involved vary from person to person, and also the type of OCD. Like we said, it's not a one size fits all for OCD. There's lots of different aspects, which means there's probably going to be lots of different genes that are relevant to those types. So a really fancy word there, etiologically heterogeneous, means that the origin has different causes. Okay, so how can we be certain that one size fits all? From a neural explanation then, so this is focusing on neurotransmitters and brain structures. The first, serotonin, or a reduction in the serotonin system, could explain some OCD cases. So serotonin is our happy neurotransmitter. It's there to regulate mood, and it's implicated in depression and in OCD. So if you have low levels of serotonin, the information about your mood is not being transmitted across synapses, so the messages aren't getting relayed, which means that your mood, other mental processes become affected. So just like for depression, where you would take an antidepressive like Prozac to change some of the neurological elements, it's the same for serotonin. You would take something like Prozac or fluoxetine, actually not fluoxetine, but some kind of treatment to rebalance the level of serotonin in your brain. Okay, so serotonin is implicated. And abnormal brain function refers to different areas of the brain. So I mentioned basal ganglia, that's in the book, so you can add some extra notes to that if you want to. But we're going to focus on abnormal functioning in the frontal lobe, so our decision-making system and our logical, rational thinking, and abnormal functioning in the left parahippocampal gyrus. And this is associated with processing unpleasant emotions. So if both of these brain systems are functioning in a way that isn't neurotypical, then we're going to have some kind of manifestation, aren't we? So if you're not able to process emotions neurotypically, that's going to impact on your day-to-day life. So 2 questions that you can do to check. I would have a go at this one, the neural basis of OCD. That is the one that people struggle with the most. A, they can't remember it, and B, they never talk about it. But it's very likely that you could get a question, describe and evaluate the neural explanation of OCD. They could be that specific, so you need to make sure you know both of them. And some answers there that you can check against what you've written. So if we go on to the evaluation then, so that's all the A1. Oh, where's the... So this is for the genetic explanation here. So we have got some good supporting evidence from twin studies. So Nestat reviewed, so looked at a meta-analysis of twin studies into OCD. 68% of identical MZ twins shared OCD compared to 31% of non-identical. So we could say, okay, there has to be some genetic element here. Obviously twins are 100% share the same DNA. But what also could be important, and that hasn't been mentioned in this study, is environmental factors. So this number isn't 100%. So there has to be some environmental factors to OCD. So that could be your little however. For candidate genes, there's way too many. So because there are 230 that are implicated, we can't identify which genes are specifically involved, which makes it very difficult to draw any conclusions and also hard to create a specific treatment. And then, like we said with this study, what about environment? So chroma, half the OCD patients in their sample had a traumatic event in the past, more severe in those with more than one trauma. So OCD usually manifests from a traumatic event. So something like if you had a burglary, people are more likely to check locks constantly, or if there was some kind of sexual abuse, more likely to wash frequently. So the environment plays a really important part. So that backs up diathesis stress. Then, like we said for Nestat, twin studies are flawed. It doesn't look at the fact they have a shared environment, their upbringing is similar. Therefore, if you're twins, maybe they're more likely to imitate each other. So that's something to bear in mind. With neural explanation, we have got some supporting evidence. So antidepressants, like we've said, serotonin is involved in depression as well, does work on the serotonin system, increasing levels and reducing OCD symptoms. So it shows that the serotonin system is involved in some way. It's giving that some internal validity. But we're not clear on what neural mechanisms are involved. So yes, we know that it's the prefrontal cortex and the parahippocampal gyrus, but like I said earlier, the basal ganglia is also involved. So some may be involved sometimes, but no system is involved all of the time. So maybe it's for certain types of OCD, one is involved more than the other. So a lot more research needs to be done into that area. We have an issue with correlation and causation, so we can't assume that because you've got abnormal functioning in the prefrontal cortex, that causes OCD. It could be that the environment has changed the way your prefrontal cortex works, which means that the OCD has manifested itself that way. So we can't be sure on correlation causation. Then, like we said, serotonin OCD link is comorbid with depression. So because the same system is involved in OCD as it is with depression, let's say somebody suffers from depression, that's impacting their serotonin system, therefore that is causing their OCD, if you see what I mean. So you could have OCD and have depression, it's comorbid with each other, but which one is affecting your serotonin system? Okay, so that's genetic and that's neural. Have a quick check it. So you've got evaluate the evidence for genetic basis, evaluate one criticism of neural, have a go at pill paragraphing these. Don't just copy it from the book, really try and practice that technique for this section. And then have a go at planning it. So I've attached a question breakdown sheet. In an ideal world, you would have had an essay plan for everything we've looked at. That could create some of your revision actually. You could use this sheet to create plans for everything. That would be a great revision tool. So split it into, this is my point, a pill paragraph essentially, because the biological approach, like I said, is the most tricky. So the more practice, the better.